as researchers of history, as researchers of environmental history, we have been trained to look at these long-term changes and the causations in all these events. So, in that sense, the long-term implications and the causes involved in the spread of diseases and the epidemics of the past have often been much bigger. And one of the most common reasons behind the transmission has been the long distance travels of people. So you have seen that in the present epidemic, the movement have also in some way been the most consequential impact of the epidemic. So I'm talking about the reverse migration of the workers that have taken place. So they walked hundreds of kilometers on foot. And although at the core of this reverse migration is the story of a green revolution, about which I wrote elsewhere, not much time here to talk about that, but COVID has actually, and the COVID led this complete lockdown has been the trigger point. So the real, the long term, if we look at the long-term reasons of these migrations, they are something else. But the COVID has actually led to the lockdown, which was the right move by the government, but then it also led to the reverse migration of the workers. Now, if we look at the history of the epidemics globally, the movement of the people or migration has actually played the most significant role in the history of disease and epidemics. So friends, in my talk today, I would focus on three major issues. First, how the disease exchanges take place. Number two, why the poor and the weak are the worst hit when epidemics come. So many countries around the globe have encountered epidemics in the past, and in certain cases they acquired the pandemic proportions also, as there were worldwide spread of the diseases after the epidemics. So since the pandemics were also characterized by the development of microbial resistance, so what happened that as a result of this, the death toll was actually very high. So in pandemics, the death toll is always very high. However, whether it is an epidemic or a pandemic, it always had grave implication on the weak. And it is often the weak who are put in a precarious survival position. So in my stories, you will find that I try to underline this naked truth, that it is often the rich and the powerful, the weakers, who are the weak people, who are the prime, it is actually the rich people who are the prime spreaders of virus, not the weak people. And when the disease acquires an epidemic proportion, then it gradually goes on to affect those who are on the margins. So then it appears that the people who are living in close proximity, who are not living in good, healthy environment, they are the spreaders of the disease. But it is always the initial spreaders are always the affluents, the richer section of the society. And we have evidences from the past which suggests that the entire native population of particular regions were decimated completely when the diseases or the epidemics came along with the affluence. So when we do these kind of studies, we get a new picture, and the earlier historical interpretations used to put various defense, and which today actually look very flimsy as the new evidence is crop up. So the earlier interpretations were completely different, and nobody talked about the travel of these diseases by the affluents. And certainly, when you don't talk about this, you are also not considering it as one of the important prime factors in, the history of the humankind. And as history as a discipline progresses from this kind of a conventional socio-economic ones to now, because we have a history which is more diverse, which is more interdisciplinary. So what we find is that the most common reasons behind the large decimation of the human population has been found to be the spread of the epidemics. So my third central point in my which will be reflected in the talk is the underlining of the significant turning points in the epidemic past. So the idea is that when we study the history of epidemics, we not only look to highlight, for example, why and how diseases exchanges have hit the weak, or it has hit them the hardest. What we also need to find out or look at is that what has been its long-term implication. And in other words, the other way to study the epidemics is in environmental terms. For example, how it has affected the humanity, how it has affected the ecology, how it defined the human engagements with the nature. So in fact, when we study the history of global epidemics in such a way, I mean, when we include the epidemic stories in our discourse, it makes the story intriguing and it makes our history very exciting reading. So if I say the least, I think it is very essential that we include epidemics and the stories of epidemics in our histories and the human history. So we must in fact include in our history the big events in which we try to understand why, where, and under which circumstances the historical events emerged. And also we need to talk about long-term changes in the human past because of these big events. So this kind of an investigation, which has been done by many leading environmental historians in recent years, leads to a completely new interpretation of history. For example, Richard Grove, who passed away unfortunately a few days ago, was a leading environmental historian, and he was one of the pioneers who advocated that as historians we must look at the writings of the naturalists and the medical officers. He in fact wrote about the startling unfamiliar environments, especially the environment of the tropics. So if we read his two very interesting books called Green Imperialism and the other one called The Nature and the Orient, he talks about all these things. Similarly, many of the environmental historians like Alfred Crosby, David Arnold, Satyadev Sen, over the last 2 decades they have done fascinating interpretations of past through epidemics lens. So to understand these 3 focal points, we look at few historical case studies. But before we talk about these cases, let me tell you why the virus takes on epidemic proportion, why it has become so recurring affair now. And let me caution you, while you do such studies of the diseases, the pathogens, the viruses, you need to follow the protocols of history. So when I'm saying protocols of history, you must have heard of this term protocol very much when the pandemic is here. People are asking you to follow the protocols when you are outside. But there is also a historical protocol. So what is there? Protocol, the historical protocol is citing the source. Simple. But yes, when we do this kind of study, we need to cross the conventional divide. And when I'm saying the conventional divide, it's the divide between humanities and science. So environmental historians have been the pioneers in this kind of a history writing, and they took the lead. They in fact learned to speak a new language. So don't get surprised. The most outlandish language that has been learned by us as historians is the natural scientist language. It is of course challenging, but then this allows us to ask some very new questions, interesting questions about human past. And for this, we need a fusion, some kind of a symbiosis of historians, the economists, the statisticians, and the scientists. So today, scientists have been able to figure out that the novel coronavirus jumped from the animals to humans, and now that it's mutating and mutating in different forms. It most likely originated in a bat. That is what many scientists claim, and possibly, of course, before passing through another mammal. While this virus was certainly not engineered in a laboratory, forget about the Trumpian interpretation, but this doesn't mean that we haven't played any role in the current pandemic. The humans have actually played a role in the pandemic. So human impingements on the natural habitats, or maybe the ecosystem degradation that we have been doing, the great damage that we have been doing to the environment, they are making virus the spillover events. And that is why the number of emerging infectious diseases and the disease outbreaks has more than tripled. And if we look at the data provided by the statisticians, every decade since the 1980s, so you will find that the outbreaks have tripled. And more than 2/3 of these diseases have actually originated in some animal. In fact, about 70% of these diseases came from wild animals. So many of the infectious diseases we are familiar with, like Ebola or HIV or the swine flu or even the avian flu, these are all zoonotic. So, what we have done by disrupting the ecosystems, we have created the conditions that allow the animal viruses to cross over into human populations. And as people move further into the territories of wild animals, and we have been doing it through deforestation, we are raising more and more livestock, these livestock are coming very close to, we are raising it very close to the forest. So we are hunting and extracting resources, and in this process, what we are doing is that we are increasingly getting exposed to the pathogens which were in isolation till now. So in the last century, the tropical forests, which have been home to around 2/3 of the world's living organisms, they have been halved completely. And this kind of a profound loss of the habitat has tripled, as I told you, and this, it also has some kind of an effect, some massive effect throughout the entire ecosystem. So habitat changes force animals and their pathogens to go elsewhere from their isolations, including the areas which are actually populated by the people, that is the newly habited area. For instance, scientists do the example of the emergence of the Nipah virus, which came in Malaysia in the late 1990s. And here, the deforestation drove the bats from their forest habitat to mango trees, which were standing on pig farms. And these bats often carried the pathogens, which it doesn't bother them. But in this case, when they came closer to the pig farms, and when the pigs came in contact with these bat droppings and the saliva, they became infected. So the pigs then went on to infect the farmers. So that's how the disease, the Nipah virus, came from bats to the pigs and then to the humans. So that is a very fascinating story of our epidemics all around the globe, and we can have a very interesting study of epidemics when we include epidemics as part of our history. So we have to move beyond beyond just socioeconomic analysis, and we have to include nature, the ecosystem, and the diseases and pathogens in our history.